The fluorescent lights of Oak Creek Memorial hum at precisely 60 Hz, a frequency that becomes invisible after 3 months. Danielle Ross has learned to work through it, around it, beneath it. The antiseptic bite of the ICU never quite fades, though, that sharp chemical edge that coats the back of your throat and settles into your scrubs like a second skin. She moves between monitors with the fluid precision of someone who has spent the last 20 years in places where hesitation kills. The limp is deliberate camouflage. No one pays attention to the slight favor of her left leg. No one asks how a civilian nurse from a quiet background might have picked up a scar tissue that runs from her hip to her ribs like a geography of survival. 3 months at Oak Creek. Long enough to be invisible. Long enough to notice things. The ICU smells like hope mixed with disinfectant this morning because the Mitchell family just arrived, and Colonel James Mitchell radiates the kind of presence that makes the air pressure change. He's in room 347 now, sitting beside a 10-year-old boy who hasn't spoken since an IED blast killed his mother 6 months ago. The boy, Aaron, clutches a pair of worn combat boots to his chest like they're the only solid thing left in the world. The boots are battered, salt-stained from desert sweat, the leather creased in patterns that speak of hard miles and harder choices. Danielle adjusts Aaron's for line, her scarred forearms visible as she reaches, and she sees the colonel's eyes track the scars for exactly 1 second before looking away. Military people recognize military people. They just don't usually say so out loud. "Morning, buddy," Danielle says to Aaron, her voice steady as still water. "How's your pain level today?" The boy doesn't answer. His grip on the boots tightens instead. The colonel shifts in his chair. His name tag reads Mitchell, and his eyes carry the particular exhaustion of a man who has already buried his wife. Danielle has seen that look before in Helmand Province, seen it in the faces of men who understood that some wounds don't bleed. She checks Aaron's oxygen saturation, 96%, good, and makes a note on the chart without looking up. Invisible work. Invisible competence. That's the protocol. Keep your head down. Keep your military background buried. Keep your clearance classified and your past in the past. But that was before the discrepancies. The supply orders started small. Missing inventory logs. Inflated billing codes. Equipment requisitioned but never received. Danielle noticed them at 2 in the morning during her second week, the kind of inconsistencies that no civilian nurse would catch, but a senior chief petty officer trained to track logistics in combat zones sees them like a sniper sees targets. $300,000 in phantom supply orders over 14 months. All routed through Dr. Sterling, the ICU senior attending physician. All signed off on by someone with access to the authorization codes. She flagged the discrepancies to administration on a Tuesday. Documented them. Attached her evidence. Submitted them through the proper channels like someone who wants to stay under the radar, not someone with a Navy Cross gathering dust in a safety deposit box. That was last week. Dr. Sterling observes her from the hallway now, his expensive watch catching the overhead light. Rolex Submariner, probably $12,000 at retail, which is interesting on a physician's salary. He's handsome in that privilege-coded way, the kind of face that belongs to boarding schools and country clubs, skin too smooth for someone his age, hair so precisely styled that it probably costs more than Danielle's monthly rent. He watches her with the eyes of a predator who has just noticed a new hunter on his territory. Not threatened yet. Calculating. Assessing. Danielle can feel the weight of his attention, but she doesn't acknowledge it. She documents Aaron's vitals in the chart, her handwriting precise and clinical. The boy watches her, these dark eyes tracking her movements with the intensity of someone trying to understand the world through observation alone. She's seen that too, in the faces of children in villages where the violence had stolen their words. "Your mother was brave," she says quietly to Aaron, still writing. "You're going to be brave too." The colonel stands abruptly. The doctor said, his voice cracks on the edges. 12 different specialists. They all said the same thing. Psychosomatic. Untreatable. They said he might never speak again. Danielle sets down her pen. turns to face him fully. The colonel is waiting for something, permission, maybe, or prayer, or someone to tell him his son isn't broken. She meets his eyes without flinching. Doctors are often wrong about what they don't understand, she says, each word measured and level. Your son is processing trauma. There's a difference between can't speak and won't speak. There's always a reason for the silence. Something in her voice, the absolute absence of doubt, the way she says it like she's read from classified files, makes the colonel study her more carefully. But before he can speak, Dr. Sterling enters the room. Colonel Mitchell, good morning. Sterling's smile is pristine, the kind of smile that has never had to earn its way through genuine difficulty. I'm Dr. Sterling, senior attending. I wanted to personally assure you that we're providing your son with the best possible care. Danielle here is one of our new nurses. Excellent work ethic. Very detail-oriented. The way he says her name is like touching a wound to watch someone flinch. Danielle doesn't flinch. She adjusts errands for port and continues her rounds, her movements unhurried and precise. Sterling's eyes follow her across the room. Actually, I wanted to speak with you about Aaron's discharge planning. Given the psychosomatic nature of his condition, he might benefit from a psychiatric facility rather than continued ICU care. The specialists were quite clear about the prognosis. He lowers his voice to the tone doctors use when delivering kindness like a lethal injection. Sometimes we have to accept what we can't fix. The colonel's jaw tightens. He's my son. He stays here. Of course. Whatever you prefer. Sterling's eyes shift back to Danielle, who is now documenting medication times on another patient's chart. Though I should mention that we've had some administrative issues in the ICU supply chain that we're currently investigating. It's unfortunate when staff members don't fully understand the complexity of hospital operations. Some people see inconsistencies where there are actually just the counting procedures they're not qualified to interpret. He delivers this message like a casual observation. Danielle keeps writing. Her hand doesn't hesitate. Her breathing doesn't change. She is translating his words into what they actually mean. I know you flagged those reports. Back off, or there will be consequences. The peculiar thing about having spent 2 decades in classified operations is that you learn the precise difference between a threat and a warning. This is a warning. Sterling doesn't know who she is yet, but he knows she's dangerous. He's sizing up whether she's a threat to his operation or just an unfortunate variable in his equation. Aaron shifts the combat boots in his arms, and the leather creaks, a sound like old weapons being drawn. The colonel's eyes return to his son, and his expression softens into something that looks like drowning. Danielle finishes her notes and moves to the doorway, and as she passes Sterling, he speaks again, his voice pitched low enough that the colonel can't hear clearly. You've been here 3 months, correct? You've done excellent work. We wouldn't want to see that interrupted by, say, a probationary review or questions about your employment history. Some background checks can get quite thorough. He smiles. I'm sure everything will be fine. Danielle stops. Turns. Meets his eyes with the kind of stillness that comes from having already survived the worst. My work speaks for itself, she says, 10 words exactly, no more. She walks past him without waiting for a response. Behind her, Dr. Sterling's smile doesn't waver. But his hands, she notices, are curled into fists so tight that his perfectly manicured nails have drawn crescents of blood from his palms. He's angry. Good. Anger is information. Anger is data. Anger means he feels threatened, which means he knows she saw something he needed to stay hidden. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 2:17 in the morning, when Aaron finally closed his eyes and the monitors settled into their steady rhythm, and the colonel pressed his face against those combat boots like they still carried the smell of his wife. The worst part was that 12 doctors, 12 different specialists in 12 different evaluation rooms, had all looked at this beautiful, traumatized child and decided he was beyond repair. That his silence was permanent. That his grief had broken something in him that medicine couldn't fix. Danielle stands at the nurse's station, reviewing the psychiatric evaluations. Page after page of clinical language describing a child's pain in the detached terminology of men who had never lost anything that mattered. Selective mutism. Acute stress disorder. Prognosis guarded. Recommended placement in long-term psychiatric care facility. She looks back at room 347, where the colonel still sits with his dead wife's boots cradled in his arms like they might still be warm. And she thinks about what those 12 doctors had failed to see. They hadn't seen that Aaron was processing something. They hadn't understood that sometimes the bravest thing a human being can do is refuse to fill the silence with words that would betray the magnitude of loss. They hadn't seen the boy at all. They'd only seen a problem they didn't know how to solve. The surgical team had just finished morning rounds when Dr. Sterling appeared in the hallway outside the ICU, his voice cutting through the quiet like a scalpel. His eyes found Danielle restocking supply carts near the nurse's station, and he raised his voice loud enough for every resident and attending physician within earshot to hear. "I'll bet $50 our little Nancy Nightingale here quits within a week. Any takers?" He smiled, teeth showing but no warmth behind it. The other doctors exchanged glances, uncomfortable, knowing the kind of silence that happens when powerful men test boundaries. Danielle took one measured breath. She looked up from the 4 catheters in her hands, met his eyes without flinching, and said quietly, "I don't quit, Dr. Sterling." He smirked, the expression lingering on his face for a moment too long. "We'll see." He turned and walked away, his shoes clicking against the tile with the confidence of someone who had never experienced real resistance. That afternoon, Danielle carried her cafeteria tray toward an empty table in the corner. Chicken, rice, a cup of black coffee that had gone lukewarm. Her scrub still held the faint smell of antiseptic from the morning's rounds, that sharp chemical bite that never quite washed out. She passed the doctor's table where Sterling sat with 3 attending physicians, laughing about something one of them had said. As she walked past, Sterling extended his foot, catching the edge of her tray. The physics were inevitable. The tray tilted, then fell. Soup exploded across the floor in a yellow-white splash that caught her left leg and soaked through to the fabric beneath. Charts scattered like leaves, patient notes, lab results, vitals tracking sheets fanning across the tile in the moment before everything stopped. The cafeteria went quiet the way a room does when blood spills in a hospital. Sterling stood, his face arranged in mock concern. "Oops. Clumsy." He stepped back, boots straddling her scattered papers as if they belonged to him now. "Pick that up, sweetheart. Unless cleaning is also outside your skill set." His tone was conversational, casual, designed to make her reaction, any reaction, look unreasonable. Danielle knelt, her movements deliberate and calm. She began gathering the papers, soup dripping from the edge of one chart onto her fingers. Her hands were steady. 20 years of field hospitals had taught her that shaking only happened when you allowed it. A tear escaped down her cheek without warning, a single involuntary drop that she hadn't authorized. She felt it happen the way a sailor might notice a seagull land on a rope, registered it, acknowledged it, and moved forward. She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, stood, and met Sterling's eyes directly. Her voice came out like still water, the kind of calm that only exists in people who have already survived the worst. "I've cleaned up bigger messes than you'll ever make." His jaw tightened. The color in his face shifted slightly, that precise moment when a predator realizes its prey might have teeth. She turned and walked to the trash bin, deposited the ruined papers, and returned to her station. The cafeteria remained silent for exactly 7 seconds. Then conversations resumed, but something had changed. The other doctors looked at Sterling differently now, not with respect, but with the careful attention one gives to someone whose behavior has become unpredictable. But Dr. Sterling wasn't finished. Unpredictability was his method, and he doubled down the only way institutional power knew how. The next morning, when Danielle arrived for her shift, she found her name on the assignment board for overnight rotation, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. in the pediatric ICU wing. Her regular day shift was gone, reassigned without explanation. She checked her phone and found 3 break requests she'd submitted the previous week still unsigned by the attending physician, which meant technically she hadn't taken any breaks, which meant she was accruing violations even though no one had told her this was coming. It was competent cruelty, the kind that left no fingerprints. During morning rounds, Sterling held up her patient notes in front of the entire team of physicians, residents, and interns. He squinted at her handwriting, his expression theatrical. "Look at this. Are we running a hospital or a kindergarten?" He exaggerated her signature, looping the letters with comic precision, drawing laughs from 2 residents who were still learning which way the wind blew. "Someone get sweetheart a coloring book." The intern smiled uncertainly. The older residents didn't smile at all. Danielle stood at the far end of the conference table and absorbed each word the way a stone absorbs water, completely, without visible reaction. What Dr. Sterling didn't see was Colonel James Mitchell sitting in the 3rd floor waiting area that same afternoon, having just finished a consultation with the neurologist about his son. The cafeteria incident had been visible from across the room, Sterling's foot extended, the tray falling, Danielle's composed response. Mitchell had felt something shift in his chest during that moment, a recognition that lived below the level of conscious thought. 20 years was a long time. 20 years, and faces faded, and the exact shade of someone's hair in sunlight became approximate. But there was something in the way she'd met Sterling's eyes, the way her hands had stayed steady while gathering papers, the particular geometry of her movements. He'd seen that before. He'd seen that in Helmand Province in 2004, in a schoolyard in Sanjin where concrete had collapsed and a 9-year-old boy with a piece of rebar through his calf had been bleeding out into dust. Mitchell waited until that evening, when his son Aaron was asleep and the ward had settled into the particular quiet of a pediatric unit after dark, a quietness made up of ventilator hisses, monitor beeps in irregular patterns, and the distant sound of a television playing somewhere behind a closed door. He found Danielle in the medication room, cross-referencing for drips against patient charts. She looked up when he entered, and something in his eyes made her pause. He was tall, the kind of tall that came from a particular kind of training, with the bearing of a man accustomed to having people listen when he spoke. His face was lined in ways that had nothing to do with age. "Senior Chief," he said quietly. Not a question. A statement using a rank he shouldn't have known. Danielle's entire body went still. The chart in her hands didn't waver, but something inside her shifted like tectonic plates. "Colonel," she said, keeping her voice level. "How is Aaron?" She was already moving past him back toward the ward, redirecting the conversation into safer channels the way you might redirect a river. "You were in Helmand," he said. It wasn't a question either. 2004, Sanjin Valley. School collapse in the Jolan district area. He followed her into the hallway. There was a boy. 9 years old. Rebar through the leg, massive blood loss, 3 doctors said he was gone. And then a female medic in navy blue showed up with a field kit and hands that moved like someone who'd seen worse. He stepped in front of her, forcing her to stop. "I was that boy. I've spent 20 years trying to remember your face, trying to remember your name. And then you walk past my table in the cafeteria and I see you let that bastard Sterling knock food out of your hands without flinching, and I know. I know exactly who you are." Danielle's hands remained still. Her breathing remained steady. But somewhere in the architecture of her chest, something cracked. "Sir, How long?" Mitchell asked. "How long have you been here?" 3 months, she said quietly. Civilian nurse. Clean background. That's all anyone needs to know. Mitchell nodded slowly, understanding the weight of those words, what they meant about her past, about the kind of protocols that turn someone into a ghost. Aaron hasn't spoken since the blast. 12 different doctors have come through that room. Neurologists, psychiatrists, trauma specialists. Every single one says his mutism is psychosomatic, that he needs time and therapy, that he's chosen not to speak. Mitchell's voice dropped lower. "But I think he's waiting for something. Someone. I think he's waiting for someone who understands." He paused. I think he's waiting for you. Before Danielle could respond, Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway of the medication room, his presence arriving before his words did. His eyes moved between them, registering the conversation, calibrating the threat. Nurse Ross, you are needed in 312. Leave Colonel Mitchell's son to the actual medical professionals. His tone was calm, but underneath it was the sound of a trap being set. Danielle excused herself and followed Sterling into the hallway. The moment they were out of earshot, he pulled her aside near the supply closet, his voice dropping into a register that was somehow more threatening than his public mockery. I made some calls about you today. Very interesting employment gaps. Reference numbers that don't quite check out. Addresses that don't exist on any official record. His eyes were cold now, the calculated eyes of someone assessing how much damage he could do. Who are you really? Danielle's voice remained level. Someone doing her job. Sterling smiled without warmth, and that smile was the moment everything shifted. For now. I've contacted the hospital board about your suspicious background. An administrative review begins Monday morning. You might want to get your affairs in order, sweetheart. I have a feeling your time at Oak Creek Memorial is about to become very short. He walked away before she could respond, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with the confidence of someone who had never failed to destroy what he decided to destroy. That night, Danielle worked through Aaron's chart with meticulous attention. The neurologist's notes mentioned chest pain during the initial evaluation, dismissed as anxiety, anxiety as psychosomatic, psychosomatic as untreatable. She cross-referenced the IED blast report. The detonation had occurred on the passenger side of the vehicle. Aaron's mother had been in the driver's seat. The blast physics suggested compression injury, potential thoracic trauma. She flagged the note in the system with a clinical recommendation for chest imaging. Within 30 minutes, her flag was deleted from the database. She entered it again. Deleted again. The second deletion came from Dr. Sterling's user account, timestamp 2:27 a.m., accompanied by a note, speculation. Remove. In the background, Chen, a quiet Marine veteran working in IT, a man with forearms covered in tattoos of unit insignias and the faces of people he'd lost, noticed the deletion pattern. He said nothing to anyone. But he began quietly backing up security footage and system logs into an encrypted external drive that sat in his desk drawer, watching, waiting, documenting the precise pattern of Sterling's sabotage. The night shift at Oak Creek Memorial wrapped around Danielle like a familiar uniform. Quiet corridors. Fluorescent lights humming their mechanical lullaby. The kind of darkness that only exists in hospitals, where time stops and the world shrinks to the size of one ICU room. She'd requested the overnight rotation herself, ostensibly because it paid an extra $2 an hour. Really, it meant fewer eyes. Fewer questions. Fewer moments when Dr. Sterling could corner her with his calculated smile and his threats wrapped in plausible deniability. Aaron Mitchell's room sat at the end of the east wing, isolated, the way Colonel Mitchell had quietly requested. The boy hadn't spoken in 6 months. Not since the IED took his mother, a combat medic, decorated, gone in a single moment of shrapnel and fire. Now he sat propped against pillows that swallowed him, his small frame lost in hospital linens, his 10-year-old hands gripping something that looked like it had been dragged through a dozen deployments. Combat boots. His mother's boots. Worn leather, scuffed at the heels, the laces still tied in a precise military knot. Danielle had seen that knot before. She'd tied it herself. 1,000 times. In a different life. She checked his vitals at midnight. Everything stable. Heart rate 88. Blood pressure 104/62. Oxygen saturation 96% on room air. The monitors beat their steady rhythm, a metronome of normalcy that 12 different specialists had insisted meant nothing. The boy's silence was psychosomatic, they'd concluded. Untreatable without psychiatric intervention. One cardiologist had actually suggested it was a behavioral attention-seeking mechanism. As if trauma was something a child could manufacture. As if loss could be managed with pharmaceutical waterboarding and motivational posters. Danielle pulled the chair closer. She didn't speak. Speaking felt like a violation of the boy's chosen silence. Instead, she Saturday watched the rise and fall of his breathing. Watched his small fingers grip those boots like they were the only thing keeping him tethered to a world that made sense. She understood that completely. Understood the physics of holding on to what you'd lost. The arithmetic of memory. At 2:56 in the morning, everything changed. The monitor's alarm cut through the silence like a surgical blade. High-pitched, insistent, wrong. Danielle's eye snapped to the screen. Heart rate 156. Irregular rhythm. Not the steady beep of normal sinus. Something jagged. Something failing. Aaron's eyes went wide, the boot slipping from his hands as his small body arched against the bed. His jugular vein distended, visibly pulsing in his neck like something trying to escape. Danielle moved. No hesitation. No internal debate. Muscle memory, faster than thought. She was already reaching for the blood pressure cuff, already reading the numbers dropping, 98/58, falling, 92/54, still falling, as Aaron's lips began to pale. Mottled. The color of someone whose heart was running on borrowed time. "I'm here," she said quietly. Not to Aaron. To herself. A prayer whispered to muscle memory and 2 decades of field medicine. She'd seen this exact constellation of symptoms in Helmand Province. A 9-year-old girl pulled from rubble in Sanjan Valley. Distended neck veins. Muffled heart sounds. Blood pressure tanking like a stone through water. Then she'd had a full trauma team. She'd had equipment. She'd had permission. Now she had a 10-year-old boy whose father was a Green Beret colonel sleeping in a chair down the hallway, trusting that Oak Creek Memorial knew how to keep his son alive. Danielle paged the on-call physician. Code Blue, ICU, Bay 7. Paged again. Waited. The monitor showed O2 saturation beginning to drift, 95, 94, 93. The boy's breathing shallow now, his ribs working like something trapped underwater. She could see the fear in his eyes. The same fear she'd seen in soldiers' eyes right before the moment they understood their situation had become fatal. Footsteps in the corridor. Finally. She turned toward the door, already formulating the handoff, already preparing to step back and let protocol reassert itself. Then Dr. Sterling appeared, his frame filling the doorway, his expression unreadable. Behind him, an empty hallway. No on-call cardiologist. No code team. "The on-call is occupied," Sterling said. Not a question. Not an offer of alternatives. "Nurse Ross, you'll keep the boy comfortable until Dr. Harmon finishes his current case. He's running about 40 minutes behind." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator on the boy in the next bay. Danielle stared at Sterling, understanding exactly what was happening. This was no longer just strategic sabotage. This was active interference. This was a man allowing a child to die because that child's father might eventually ask uncomfortable questions about supply order discrepancies. This was a calculation made in the half-second it took Sterling's eyes to flick from the monitor to her face and back again. Aaron's blood pressure dropped to 88/50. Colonel Mitchell appeared behind Sterling, still in the same clothes from yesterday, his eyes immediately fixing on the monitor, on the numbers, on his son's face. He understood vital signs the way most people understand language. His entire body went rigid. "My son is dying," Mitchell said. Not a question. A statement of fact. Military precision. A command delivered with absolute certainty. Sterling didn't move. "I'm sure Nurse Ross can keep him comfortable until the doctor arrives." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Danielle looked at Aaron. The boy's eyes had lost their focus, the bright intelligence of a 10-year-old beginning to slip into the vagueness of shock. She looked at Colonel Mitchell, at the barely restrained violence in his shoulders. She looked at the monitor, at the numbers that were writing a narrative in real time, a story that ended in exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds if nothing changed. She made her choice the way she'd made choices in Helmand Province. The way she'd made them in Fallujah. Without hesitation. Without permission. Without calculation. "Colonel Mitchell, hold your son still," she said. Her voice had changed. The deferential tone was gone, burned away like morning mist under a sun that had been hiding for months. This was the voice of someone who had pulled bleeding children from rubble. Someone who had held a pressure bandage on a femoral artery for 12 minutes while a dust-off bird carved its way through hostile airspace. Hold him absolutely still. She was already moving before the words finished. The crash cart was 3 steps away. The pericardiocentesis tray, syringes, 18-gauge needle, the works, was exactly where it should be because she'd learned long ago that protocol existed for moments just like this one. She didn't ask permission. Permission was a luxury for people whose children had time. The needle went in beneath the xiphoid process, angled toward the left shoulder. She'd done this in tents. She'd done this in caves. She'd done this once in a Taliban-controlled village with nothing but a combat medic's instinct and a prayer that went unanswered until it suddenly wasn't. Her hands were steady as a surgical laser. Steadier. Better. Because steadiness was all that stood between Aaron Mitchell and a body bag. The needle advanced. 1 centimeter. 2. She felt the slight change in resistance that meant she'd breached the pericardial sac. She attached the syringe and withdrew gently. The plunger came back red. Dark red. Blood. 60 cubic centimeters of blood that had been crushing his heart like a fist in a pressure cooker. Aaron gasped. Air returned to his lungs. The color came back to his lips, not normal, not yet, but moving toward it. The monitor showed his heart rate dropping, regularizing. The irregular rhythm smoothing out like a ship finding calm water. 120. 90. 82. Sinus rhythm. Steady. Alive. Dr. Sterling's face went the color of old dishwater. Then red. A deep, furious crimson that started at his jaw and climbed toward his hairline. "You just ended your career," he said quietly. The voice of someone who'd lost absolute control and had only threats left to throw. "You practiced outside your scope. You touched that child without attending physician authorization. I witnessed it. I documented it. 40 minutes from now, you'll be escorted from this building by security and you'll never practice nursing anywhere in the state of North Carolina." Danielle didn't respond. She was already checking Aaron's pupils, already assessing his breathing, already reading the story that the monitors were telling her. A story of a boy who was going to survive the night because a Navy corpsman hadn't forgotten how to keep promises. She didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Simply continued her assessment with a kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward, his hand on Sterling's shoulder. The grip looked gentle. It wasn't. "Step back, Dr. Sterling." It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered in the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Dr. Sterling arrived at Aaron's bedside 3 minutes after the boy's oxygen saturation had climbed from 68 to 92, his small chest rising and falling with the rhythm of a child given back his life. Danielle stood motionless beside the bed, her scrub soaked through with blood that had come from the needle aspiration, her hand steady as surgical steel. The attending physician who should have authorized the procedure was still 20 minutes out, responding to a text message from a colleague 3 floors down. Sterling stopped in the doorway. His eyes moved from Aaron, breathing, stable, alive, to Danielle covered in blood, to the empty needle wrapper on the bedside table. Then to her face. She didn't flinch under his stare. She didn't offer explanation or apology. She simply met his eyes without blinking, her breathing controlled, her posture unchanged despite everything she'd just done. Sterling's jaw worked as if he were chewing something bitter. He pulled out his phone before he'd even left the room. The fluorescent lights hummed their sterile song above them as his fingers moved across the screen. One message. Then another. Then a call that lasted 90 seconds, his voice low and clipped into the receiver. Board Member Holloway. Sterling. I need to discuss a staffing issue that's going to require documentation. Serious documentation. Can you have Chen in IT flag some employment records by morning? No, not HR, direct to administration. Personal favor, I know. I remember that supply contract you needed pushed through. My recommendation made all the difference. Time to balance the ledger. He hung up without waiting for confirmation. He already knew what Holloway would say. They always did. By 03:47 hours, Sterling had made 6 calls. Each one a lever. Each one a debt being called in. Board members who'd approved expensive no-bid contracts that benefited him. Hospital administrators who'd looked the other way during equipment audits. An investigator he'd quietly recruited 3 years ago, someone who owed him more than professional courtesy, someone who understood that loyalty could be purchased, and that Sterling was a good customer. I need everything, Sterling told the investigator. Gaps in her employment history. Discrepancies. Anything that suggests her credentials might not be authentic. Have it on the administrator's desk by 6 a.m. Sterling didn't know who Danielle really was. He didn't need to know. He knew she was a threat to his supply fraud, to his position, and now to his professional authority. A nurse who performed a procedure beyond her scope. A nurse who acted without authorization. A nurse who saved a child's life and made a doctor look incompetent in the process. The calls to her fabricated references took another hour. Sterling made them personally, his voice smooth as silk. Hello, this is Dr. Sterling from Oak Creek Memorial in Raleigh. I'm conducting a reference check on a former employee, Danielle Ross. You're listed as her supervisor at Seattle General from 2019 to 2021. The voice on the other end, an actor Sterling had hired from a temp agency, someone waiting for his cut, played confusion beautifully. I'm sorry, who? We don't have any record of a Danielle Ross in our system. Not in 2019. Not in any of our medical records. Sterling smiled as he hung up. By morning, he'd have 3 such calls documented. 3 references that didn't exist. 3 gaps in history that would suggest identity fraud. By morning, Danielle Ross would be unemployable. At 0600 hours, Danielle was summoned to the administrator's office. She wore clean scrubs now. Her hands no longer bore Aaron's blood. She walked down the corridor with the same measured pace she'd shown all night, and nobody watching would have seen anything but a tired nurse heading to a meeting. The administrator, a woman named Patricia Chen, sat behind her desk with a folder open. Not Danielle's real personnel file. The fabricated one. The one Sterling had orchestrated. Behind her stood Sterling, his arms crossed, his posture relaxed, his expression one of professional concern. We have some serious concerns, Patricia began, her voice careful. 3 former employers have reported inconsistencies in your background. Employment gaps we can't verify. References that don't check out. And now this incident with a pediatric patient, performing a procedure that's far outside your scope as a civilian nurse. Danielle didn't sit down. She didn't ask for a lawyer. She didn't defend herself. She simply stood there, hands at her sides, while Sterling watched. Practicing outside scope of practice, Patricia continued, reading from a standard termination template. Performing medical procedures without physician authorization. And based on these reference checks, we have concerns about credential falsification. The words fell like hammers. Patricia slid a document across her desk. Your badge is being confiscated. We'll need your keys, your ID, access codes, everything. Security will escort you to your locker. Danielle picked up the termination letter. She didn't read it. She already knew what it said. Sterling cleared his throat softly behind her. I told you you'd quit within a week, he said, his voice almost gentle. Guess I was wrong. You got fired instead. He smiled. A predator's smile. Danielle turned and walked past him without responding. As she moved down the hallway, Sterling followed, maintaining a distance of 6 feet. Security waited by her locker. They watched as she cleared it out, a change of scrubs, a protein bar, a photograph of her late husband in his dress navy uniform, hidden at the bottom. The photograph she'd kept for 20 years. Sterling stood in the hallway, his arms crossed, his expression one of triumph as the security guard locked the locker behind her. The evening came wet with rain that hammered against Raleigh like suppressing fire. Danielle drove past the gates of Oakwood Cemetery and parked near the back, where the old graves lay beneath live oaks that had outlived 3 generations of mourners. She knelt in the rain beside a marble headstone that bore only a name and dates. No rank. No unit. No medals. No indication of what the man beneath had given, or what had been taken from him. Lieutenant Commander David Ross. Navy SEAL. Killed in a classified operation that had erased both their names from every official record. Danielle pressed her forehead against the wet stone and whispered to it like the stone could hear. I tried to stay hidden like they ordered. Like you made me promise after they buried the operation and told us our names weren't real anymore. I tried to stay invisible. I tried to be just a nurse. Her voice was thin, barely audible above the rain. But I failed him, David. I failed that boy. I was supposed to help him and instead I'm fired because I actually did my job. I was supposed to follow protocol and let the 12 specialists tell his father there was nothing we could do. I was supposed to keep my head down. And I failed you too. I broke the promise. The rain washed across her face and there was no way to tell if she was crying. She stayed there for another minute, 2 minutes, her hands in the wet grass, her knees soaking through into the earth. Then she stood up. The rain continued. The cemetery remained silent except for the sound of water running through gutters and off the marble stones. She walked back to her car without looking back. At home, Danielle filled 2 suitcases and 1 duffel bag. She pulled her discharge papers from the Navy, the ones that didn't exist officially, and held them in her hands. She was packing a 3rd bag when her 17-year-old son Marcus arrived, soaking wet from the rain, his hand shaking as he held a wooden shadow box. Inside, beneath glass, lay medals. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. Navy Cross. All the decorations she'd been ordered to hide. All the proof that she was something other than what she'd pretended to be. Mom. Marcus's voice was broken. Aaron finally spoke. He's asking for you. He's asking for the nurse. And they won't let you in because they fired you and I don't understand why you're just letting this happen. Danielle looked at her son. Looked at the medals. Looked at the proof of everything she'd been forced to bury. I can't, Marcus. If I show up at that hospital, if I make a scene, they're going to ask questions. And I was ordered not to answer questions. Your father made me promise. Marcus stepped closer, the shadow box trembling in his hands. What would Dad say right now? If he was here? What would Senior Chief Petty Officer David Ross say about his wife packing a bag instead of fighting? Danielle closed her eyes. Opened them. Looked at her son's face, at David's face, really, the same jawline, the same stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Get dressed, she said quietly. We have somewhere to be. Marcus stood in the doorway of her apartment with the shadow box trembling in his hands. 17 years old, built like his father, but his eyes had always been his mother's, dark water that saw too much. The mahogany case held what Danielle had kept hidden for 2 decades, medals pressed into velvet like artifacts from another woman's life. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. Another Purple Heart. Navy Cross. The metals caught the lamplight and threw it back. Mom, Marcus said, his voice cracking. Aaron Mitchell spoke today. First time in 6 months. He asked for you. They won't let you in, but he asked for you by name. Danielle didn't move. 10 years of learning not to move when everything inside her wanted to fracture. The hospital's telling everyone you violated patient protocol. That you're suspended pending investigation. They're saying you practice medicine without a license. Marcus's hand shook as he opened the case. But you didn't, did you? This is what you did. This is who you are. The apartment was small, the kind of temporary shelter she'd chosen precisely because it felt like nothing. No photographs on the walls. No framed memories. Nothing that could connect her to the woman she used to be. But Marcus had brought her past through the door, and it sat in mahogany velvet in his trembling hands. "Take me to the hospital," Danielle said. The drive took 17 minutes. Oak Creek Memorial rose against the Raleigh skyline like a monument to controlled chaos. Outside the emergency board meeting, Marcus didn't hesitate. He pushed through the conference room doors, and the voice that came out of him wasn't a teenager's, it was a soldier's announcement, steady and declarative. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross." The room went dead silent. Administrator Chen stopped mid-sentence. Board members turned. Dr. Sterling's face drained color like someone had opened a valve. At that same moment, Colonel Mitchell rose from Aaron's bedside in the ICU 3 floors above, something in his chest recognizing what he'd suspected since the moment he'd looked into her eyes during rounds. He climbed the stairs instead of taking the elevator, his boots striking each step like a countdown. When he entered the conference room, the administrator was already looking confused, already defensive. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward in his dress uniform, the ribbons of a career soldier catching the fluorescent lights. His voice, when he spoke, was rough as gravel. "She saved my life in Helmand Province, 2004. Pulled me out of a collapsed compound. 20 years I've been looking for her, and I found her here." He paused, jaw clenching. "Cleaning up messes. Just like she promised she would." The door opened again. Commander Price, still in hospital scrubs from his own physical therapy sessions, limped in alongside a man in a dark suit. Behind them came Gunnery Sergeant Chen from IT, carrying a laptop with an expression that suggested he'd been waiting for permission to speak. The SEAL team leader, Commander Price, stepped forward. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen classified operations, who'd watched senior enlisted sailors do things that official records would never acknowledge. "Bronze Star with Valor," he said, looking directly at the board members. "Purple Heart. Second Purple Heart. Navy Cross." Each medal name hung in the air like a sentence being read aloud. "I was in Helmand with her. I know what she did. I know what she sacrificed to stay off the books, to keep her family safe after we erased her from the official record." The FBI agent, the one who'd been at Oak Creek investigating an unrelated fraud case, had already begun pulling files on his laptop. His eyes found Sterling, and something shifted in the room's pressure, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. "Dr. Sterling," the agent said quietly, "we're going to need to discuss your financial records. The phantom supply orders. The kickback payments. Everything." His fingers flew across the keyboard. "We have documentation. We have phone records of you attempting to obstruct a federal investigation by threatening this nurse. And we have," he looked at Chen, who nodded, "every frame of security footage you tried to delete." Chen pulled up the files. "The cafeteria." Sterling's hand lashing out, Danielle's tray hitting the floor, papers scattering like evidence. Her face in profile, not flinching, not breaking, just breathing through it. Then the late-night footage, Sterling in the supply office at 0300 hours, his fingers flying across a keyboard, his face twisted with desperation as he tried to erase the phantom orders. His midnight phone calls to board members. The traces of his entire scheme laid bare on screen. Sterling's hand went to his tie. Loosened it. The confident surgeon who terrorized floors and bent bureaucrats to his will was dissolving in real time, his power sources vaporizing like water on hot asphalt. His phone buzzed. Then again. Then continuously. Text after text from board members, from fellow physicians, from his own lawyer declining representation. His network wasn't just fracturing, it was evaporating. "You tried to destroy a nurse's life to cover your own crimes," the administrator said, and her voice was the kind of calm that preceded institutional action. You attempted to interfere with patient care. You deliberately delayed treatment to a child. She paused, and the pause lasted exactly 3 seconds. You're suspended pending full investigation. Your credentials are revoked effective immediately. Sterling stood, and for a moment, he looked like he might say something, some final threat, some last play for control. But there was nothing left to play with. The room had witnessed the full architecture of his corruption, and the authorities in the room had already begun dismantling it stone by stone. Danielle watched from the doorway, and her face remained expressionless. Not because she was cold, but because the woman standing in the conference room was no longer the civilian nurse who'd accepted humiliation in silence. She was Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, and her composure in that moment wasn't restraint. It was command. The quietest kind of authority, the kind that came from having already survived the worst this world could offer. Colonel Mitchell turned from the spectacle of Sterling's collapse and looked at her across the room. Their eyes met for a long moment, and something passed between them: recognition, respect, the understanding of two people who'd kept secrets long enough to know the weight of them. 6 months later, Danielle walked past a strip mall on the outskirts of downtown Raleigh. Through a storefront window, she saw Dr. Sterling sitting at a folding table beside a bail bondsman's office. His suit was wrinkled. His hair had gone gray at the temples. He was trying to sell cut-rate insurance policies to pedestrians who didn't stop, didn't look, didn't care. He didn't see her pass. She continued to Oak Creek Memorial, where the lobby still smelled of floor wax and antiseptic and the particular brand of hope that clung to hospital air. Her badge now read Director of Trauma Services. The ICU was her domain now, the entire department restructured under her leadership, protocols rewritten, safety measures implemented, every system optimized toward the single principle she'd learned in field hospitals across 2 war zones: the patient comes first, always, regardless of cost. Aaron Mitchell sat in room 347, his father beside him, those worn combat boots positioned on the bedside table like a memorial to his mother, like a promise being kept. When Danielle entered, the boy's face lit up. His voice, when he spoke it, was clear and strong, each word formed with the certainty of someone who'd learned that silence was a choice, not a prison. "Nurse Ross, I told Dad that Mom's boots helped me remember what she said. She said warriors keep going even when they're scared, like you did. She said that's what being brave really means." Danielle knelt beside his bed, and Colonel Mitchell, who'd watched her save his life 2 decades ago and was now watching her save his son's, extended his hand. When she took it, his grip was firm, military precise, the handshake of one warrior recognizing another. "My son talks about you every day," Colonel Mitchell said. "Says when he grows up, he wants to help people the way you helped him. The way you help everyone in this hospital, even when it costs you everything." In the hallway afterward, Marcus appeared with coffee, wearing hospital scrubs now, pre-med at Duke, already on his way to becoming something that mattered. Commander Price stopped by between sessions, limping but stable, saluting Danielle with a grin that suggested the world was making a small amount of sense again. Gunnery Sergeant Chen waved from IT, still guarding security footage, still protecting the record. The hospital administrator approached with a new hire, a woman with suspicious employment gaps, a limp that spoke of old injuries, hands that didn't shake during crisis situations. "Director Ross," the administrator said, "thought you'd want to interview this one personally." Danielle saw the signs. The controlled breathing. The situational awareness. The way this woman's eyes tracked exits and assessed potential threats. She'd seen that training before, had done that training herself, once, in another life. She smiled. "Welcome to Oak Creek Memorial. What's your background?" The woman met her eyes. "Classified." "It's complicated." "It always is," Danielle said quietly. "You're going to fit in just fine here." That evening, she visited her husband's grave for the first time since the night she'd knelt in the rain and whispered her failure. The stone bore his name, his dates, his rank. She placed her Director of Trauma Services badge against the marble, let it rest there for a moment. "I kept my promise as long as I could," she said to the stone, to the wind, to the man who'd asked her to disappear. Stayed hidden. Stayed quiet. Let them have their official story. She paused. Then I chose the mission over the cover. I chose the boy. You would have done the same. She stood, straightened her jacket, and limped back toward her car. Behind her, the cemetery was quiet, the rain-soaked grass shining in the evening light like a memorial in itself. If you found yourself rooting for Danielle to reveal her truth, if you felt the weight of hidden sacrifice, please like and subscribe for more stories about the quiet heroes walking among us. What would you have done in her position? Drop a comment below. I read every single one.